Welcome back to another episode of Opal Wave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH and helping you tune your deck to your meta. I'm your host Jacob, and today we're going to be looking at Hinata Dawn Crowned, which is a 4/4 Jeskai aligned Kirin Spirit with flying, trample. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target. Spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast for each target. And there's a few different directions you could go with this deck. I ended up doing more of the X-Spell Tribal kind of thing, but you could also do like a Voltron type strategy where your auras cost less and your opponent's removal spells cost more, or you could do kind of a Staxy deck if you wanted to. So let me know what you did with your version of Hinata in the comments below. A big shout out to Shuddy for pointing out that I could be recording these in 1080p, so I hope the overall quality of these videos is easier for you guys to digest. As usual, the deck lists are in the description below, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. In the Skirmish version, I ended up doing a Fireball Tribal type of deck, and we've got some of the usual suspects like Archmage and Moretus and the Stormkiln Artist, which will both give us some decent value when we are casting our instants and sorcery spells. Ardent Elementalist is another cool card, basically returning instants and sorceries from our graveyard to our hand. Battlefield Thaumaturge almost acts like a second Hinata, not as efficient because it only reduce the cost of the instant sorceries for each creature it targets, and it only affects instants and sorceries, which really isn't that big of a deal. Some mutate creatures. So when you cast these creatures for their mutate cost, they do target as a spell. So the Dreamtail Heron and the Sea Dasher Octopus are both going to be reduced by 1 when you cast them for their mutate costs. Unfortunately, the Lordrakus has 2 colored pips, so Hinata will not reduce the cost of that, but it's nice if we want to trigger an extra mutate on some of our other mutate cards. Remembering Mystic, just another way to get extra value when we cast our instant and sorcery spells, do some blocking, maybe attack people if we want to go on the offensive. Radiant Scroll Wielder, very cool card. Instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink, and gives us an extra way to recur our instants and sorceries, much like the Ardent Elementalist. Then we also have Soulfire Grandmaster, who does more or less the same thing with instants and sorcery spells you control have lifelink. It's actually really cool since we're going to be doing fireball type stuff. It also has another ability where you pay 4, and the next time you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand this turn, put that card into your hand instead of putting it into your graveyard as a resolve. So a cool way to kind of just keep that fireball type spell in your hand. In the battle version, we'll see some pretty sweet combos that we use this card with. Spectacle Mage and Thrix both reduce the cost of spells with CMC 5 or greater. So when you take a fireball spell, and let's say you make X equals 4, the CMC of that spell on the stack is considered to be 5. So Thrix and the Spectacle Mage will both reduce that by an additional 1. So if you have Spectacle Mage and Hinata out and you cast Fireball X is 4, targeting one thing, that will get reduced by 2. Essentially making your 5 CMC spell only cost 3, so it's pretty sweet. Zafei Thunder Conductor. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, scry 1. If that spell's mana value is 5 or greater, create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. If that spell's mana value is 10 or greater, Zafei Thunder Collector deals 10 damage to an opponent chosen at random. So really easy for us to get some pretty high costs on our X spells, since Hinata is just going to reduce that cost. So we could easily hit the 5 mana value threshold and the 10 mana value threshold with Hinata on board. So a really sweet card that we can use basically as a finisher. In the sorceries, got some fireball type stuff. Crackle with Power, a very cool one, deals 5 times X damage to each of X targets. It costs XXX, so it doesn't take a lot for this spell to deal a ton of damage to our opponents. Definitely a pretty sweet finisher spell. Curse of the Swine, exile X target creatures. Basically, this is going to cost 2 blue, and you exile all creatures on the board that aren't yours, unless you really want to exile your creatures. I don't know why you would do that, but if you want to, you can. And then they each get a 2/2 green boar creature token. So a very powerful removal spell in the context of Hinata. Deep Analysis, target player draws 2 cards, which will cost 3 mana when you target yourself. And then on the flashback, you only have to pay 1 mana and 3 life to basically draw another 2 cards. So pretty sweet. And then we've got more fireball spells. The classic fireball, Giant Simulating Inferno. Rolling Thunder is pretty sweet. Meteor Swarm is just a nice removal spell. And the Soulfire Eruption gives us some really sweet card advantage, as well as some potential removal. If you can target 6 different targets with this, the spell basically just costs 3 red, which is pretty sweet. Mystical Retrieval and Pull from the Deep, as well as Reconstruct History, just some easy recursion that gets reduced by Hinata. Reconstruct History will basically cost a red and a white to get back a bunch of stuff from your graveyard, so really sweet there. And then we have Smoke Spirit's Aid, a new card from the Precon, where we basically target X target creatures, and we create a red aura for each of those creatures that's enchanting that creature. And when enchanted creature dies, it deals 1 damage to its controller, and you create a treasure token. So you can basically pay 1 red, put all these auras on your opponent's creatures, and then you can use one of your fireball type effects to kill them all and make a bunch of treasure tokens. Really sweet card here. For the instance, we've got Apostle's Blessing, which is really cool. So for an Phyrexian white and a colorless, target artifact or creature you control gains protection from artifacts or from the color of your choice until end of turn. So essentially, this is a free protection spell in the context of Hinata, because Hinata will make the spell cost 1 color less, and then you can just pay 2 life to cast this spell. Really sweet card here. Break Ties, just a flexible removal spell that can basically just cost 1 less. Not bad. Comet Storm, another fireball effect. Crush Contraband, basically 2 mana to exile a target artifact and a target enchantment, which is actually really sweet for 2 mana. Disorder on the Court, I like this card a lot. Exile X target creatures, then investigate X times. Return the exiled cards to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So basically a way for us to just get a ton of these clue tokens and draw a bunch of cards potentially. Then we've got some removal, stuff like Dissolve, Neutralize, Ionize. These spells are going to get cost reduced by Hinata by 1, so these are essentially just counter spells. While we have our commander out, which really not that bad. Rewind is kind of a fun one. Costs 4 mana, but it will only cost 3, and then untap 4 lands, so you're actually going mana positive on that one. Spell Swindle, I'm a big fan of this card. It's costs a lot, but you can get a ton of treasures if you can time it right, and with Hinata out, it only costs 4, so pretty good. Sublime Epiphany, this card is also really sweet in the context of Hinata. Choose 1 or more counter target spell, counter target activated or triggered ability, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, or target player draws a card. So basically every mode on this targets. So if you pick 4 modes on this spell only costs 2 blue, which is kind of hilarious, actually, with Hinata out. Volcanic Geyser, just an instant speed. Fireball, it only targets 1 player, or actually only 1 target, but still not bad. And then you find the Villain's Lair, just another counter spell that can also double as a way for us to draw through our deck, draw 2 cards, and discard 2 cards. With the artifacts, we got some pretty straightforward ramp. We've got the Elementalist's Palette. Whenever you cast a spell with X and its mana cost, put 2 charge counters on Elementalist's Palette. You can either tap it for 1 mana of any color, or you can add a colorless for each charge counter on Elementalist's Palette. So as you cast your fireballs, this artifact is going to continue to ramp up and up and up, and eventually we can use it to cast some pretty big fireballs. Primal Amulet, I like this card a lot, and since the sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, put a charge counter on Primal Amulet. Then if there are 4 or more charge counters on it, you may remove those counters and transform it. And when you transform it, it becomes a land. With tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. When you use that mana, to cast an instant or sorcery spell, you copy it. So a really sweet card. And then we've got Pyromancer's Goggles, which essentially does what the flip side of Primal Amulet does. Add red, and when you cast a red instant or sorcery spell with that red mana, you will copy that spell. So basically just makes our fireballs more potent. Then we've got Double Vision in our enchantments, which is just another way for us to copy our fireball spells. Firemind's Research, really sweet. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a charge counter on Firemind's Research. You can either remove 2 counters to draw a card or remove 5 counters to deal 5 damage to any target. Then we've got Metallurgic Summoning. I like this card because, much in the same vein as the Zafei, this will see what you choose for X when you cast this spell. So if you cast a Fireball for X is 5, Metallurgic Summonings will create a 6/6 colorless construct artifact creature token. So pretty sweet interaction there. Precognition Field, just a way for us to look at the top card, maybe get a little bit extra card advantage. If we see something we don't like on top of our deck, we can get rid of it. And then we've got the Mirari Conjecture. Basically, the first 2 modes return instants and sorceries to our hand, and then the final one lets us copy our instants and sorceries. Just more ways for us to get more value out of our fireball spells. With the land base, we got lands that enter tapped, we got lands that are entering untapped, a good bit of basics, basically tuned to the overall color spread, as we usually do, just to make sure that we're not going too fast here, just nice and steady. And a Mystic Sanctuary, since we have a good bit of islands, just an extra way for us to get those fireballs back. In the battle version, we're still kind of doing a little bit of the fireball type shenanigans, but we've definitely made some pretty sweet upgrades and added some cards that are kind of ridiculous in the context of Hinata. Added Archaeomancer as an additional Ardent Elementalist, and basically these are going to kind of be combo pieces with Ghostly Fligger, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Still got the Archmage Emeritus and the Stormkiln Artist, both are really great. Grand Arbiter Augustin IV is another way for us to make our spells cost less and our opponent's spells cost more. Really sweet stacks piece, as well as an enabler in our deck. Imperial Recruiter can tutor for pretty much all the creatures in our deck, outside of a very few of them like Jin-Gitaxias or Kaikar, Niv-Mizzet, and yeah, but outside of that, it's gonna be able to hit pretty much everything we need. Jin-Gitaxias, kind of going on that theme of my spells are easier to cast and your spells are harder to cast. Basically copies our artifact, instant, or sorcery spells, at least the first one we cast each turn. And then counters the first artifact, instant, or sorcery spell our opponents cast. So really sweet card here. Kaikar, another way for us to kind of make more mana when we cast our instant sorcery spells by making spirits, and then also we can sacrifice those spirits to add a red. Funny enough, Hinata is a spirit, so we can sacrifice Hinata to Kaikar if we really need to. Say it's gonna get removed anyway, you can just use Kaikar to sack it. Pretty sweet interaction there. Niv-Mizzet, another really sweet card in the context of Spellslinger. We're not always going to have Hinata out, so having some other finisher type cards that can kind of control the game for us is going to be really strong. Paragon Drake, another one of our potential combo pieces, and we've still got the Soulfire Grandmaster, really sweet card. And once we get into the instant sorceries, we'll kind of go over how this is going to be an enabler as far as our infinite combos. Spellseeker, really great card. Since we are dealing with some X spells, we can grab those X spells with Spellseeker, since the X counts as 0 while it's not on the stack. And then the Willbreaker, since we have some ways to target our opponent's stuff, we can just gain control of it. Be a really strong card here. In the instance, we're still on Apostle's Blessing. This card is just, it's so good at protecting Hinata or any other of our pieces for essentially free. So I have the Comet Storm. I like this card a lot in the context of this deck. Disallow, essentially becoming a 2 mana counter target spell activated ability or triggered ability, so like a super counter spell essentially. Disdainful Stroke, negate, Dovin's Veto. Just some cheap counter magic we can use. That's still pretty good, even if we don't have Hinata out. So it's pretty decent. Then we've got Drowning Dream. So we can, if we have Hinata out, we can target 2 players and essentially make this 1 blue and X to draw a bunch of cards and make our opponents mill a bunch. Expansion Explosion also has 2 targets where you can deal target X damage to any target, and then target player draws X cards. So basically, for 4, you can deal at least 2 damage and draw 2 cards, which isn't terrible. But obviously, you can pump a lot more mana into this if you really want to. We've got Ghostly Flicker. So if we have Ghostly Flicker and Archaeomancer and like a Peregrine Drake, we can target these 2 for essentially 1 mana, since this targets 2 things. So for 1 mana, we'll flicker both of these. Peregrine Drake will enter the battlefield and untap 5 lands, and then Archaeomancer will enter, or the Ardent Elementalist will enter and return the Ghostly Flicker to your hand. So from there, you can create infinite mana and sink that into like one of your X spells, and just kill the table from there. Magma Opus, another really sweet card. Deal 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. Tap 2 target permanents. Create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token and draw 2 cards. So if you split up that 4 damage, and with the additional 2 targets that you get to tap, the spell essentially costs blue and a red to get a ton of value out of. So kind of a ridiculous card. Reality Spasm. Tap X target permanents or untap X target permanents, and with the Soulfire Grandmaster and the Reality Spasm, if we can make 7 mana, you can make infinite mana. So we'll activate the Soulfire Grandmaster for 4 mana, and then with the 2 blue, we can untap any number of target permanents. So far you've used 6 mana to do this, and you'll return the Reality Spasm to your hand. So as long as you can target 7 permanents to untap, you'll be able to produce infinite mana. And then from there, like before, we can sink that into one of our fireball type spells and just in the game from there. Volcanic Offering, another really sweet card in the context of Hinata. Destroy target non-basic land you don't control and target non-basic land of an opponent's control you don't control. And then Volcanic Offering deals 7 damage to target creature you don't control and 7 damage to target creature of an opponent's choice you don't control. So this spell targets 4 different things and costs 5 mana. With Hinata out, the spell costs 1 mana. So really cool. Destruction spell. We can hit some of our opponent's really annoying non-basic lands without having to destroy all the lands and irritate people. You find some prisoners, basically 1 mana to destroy target artifact, or we can exile top 3 cards of an opponent's library. If they cast like a Worldly Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Lightened Tutor, any of those cards, we can just steal whatever they tutored off of the top of their deck and use it for ourselves. So a really cool card here. With the artifacts, we've kind of condensed things a little bit, got more of that 2 mana ramp. Since Hinata is on 4, 2 is a really great spot for us to be ramping as far as the play pattern of turn 2 ramp, turn 3 Hinata, really strong. We've also got the Gilded Lotus, it's a really nice way for us to just get a bunch of mana, since some of our combos are pretty mana intensive and we can sink more mana into our fireball type stuff. Gilded Lotus is a really great card in this deck. Also makes casting things like Nibzet super easy, since Gilded Lotus will basically pay for either 3 blue or 3 red on this creature. One of the interesting cards that I've added to this deck is Mycosynth Lattice, and some of you might be scratching your heads. All permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. All cards that aren't on the battlefield, spells, and permanents are colorless, and players may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. And the reason why this card is in the deck is because of Heliod's Intervention and Byforce. So if all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types, we can pay 1 mana with Byforce and destroy all of our opponent's permanents. Or with Heliod's Intervention, we can pay double white and destroy all of our opponent's permanents, essentially ending the game on the spot. If your opponents want to keep playing after that, good on them. They're essentially tilt proof at that point. But yeah, this is a pretty interesting way for us to lock out our opponents. And the enchantments, we've still got the metallurgic summonings. I think this card's super sweet. Since we have a lot of high costing spells in the deck, this card's going to pump out some really fat beaters. And then, of course, for 5 mana later on in the game, you can return instants and sorceries from your graveyard to your hand once the game's kind of gone on for a while and people are losing steam. Rhystic Study, a great card for us to draw spells. Don't forget, always pay that 1. 1,000-Year Storm. As we cast the instants and sorceries, we copy them for each instant and sorcery you cast before this turn. And then you can choose new targets for the copy. Really sweet card once you get rolling with some of these other cheaper instants. This card will do some really crazy shenanigans. With the lands, you'll see that we've reduced the amount of lands that are entering tapped. If you've been on my channel or seen my other videos, you'll see that as we move up in power level, our mana base is going to get improved, mainly in terms of how our lands are entering the battlefield. If your lands are all entering tapped, it's going to slow your game playing down pretty significantly. So mixing it up a little bit, especially with the ramp being more efficient now, we can use. It's okay to still have some lands entering the battlefield tapped. You don't, especially in like the lower power levels. But we have definitely increased the number of lands that have the potential to enter untapped. Before I move on to the glory version of Hinata, if you like the content that I'm providing and you feel like you've gained a little bit more perspective on power levels in EDH, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below letting me know what commander you'd like to see me brew next. And on to the glory version of Hinata. And Hinata in the context of cEDH is super interesting. We're not really going to be doing a lot of X-Spell shenanigans. Hinata's real power is going to shine because it enables a lot of our combos by reducing the cost of them, but it also makes it harder for our opponents to interact with us. There's a lot of free spells that get slung around in cEDH. We're talking Force of Will, Force of Negation, Pact of Negation, Force of Vigor. All these free spells are now going to cost at least 1 extra mana now. So in the context of cEDH, this card is super powerful. Going on to the creatures, we've added some really strong cards like Darkside Extortionist, Drannith Magistrate to stop our opponents from casting their commanders, or even stopping them from casting cards from their graveyard with an Underworld Breach or something like that. Dualcaster Mage with Twin Flame. So normally this combo is 5 mana, but with Hinata out, this combo is only going to cost 4 mana, 3 red, and 1 colorless pip for the Dualcaster Mage. Esper Sentinel, really great form of card draw. We've got a Grand Abolisher to stop opponents from interacting with us on the turns that we want to combo off. Grand Abolisher is still in the deck. This paired with Hinata is going to make casting spells really hard for our opponents, essentially making those spells cost 2 instead of 0, or even some of the targeted removal. So like an Abrade is going to cost your opponent 4 mana instead of 2, which is kind of ridiculous in the context of cEDH, especially if we've got stuff like Esper Sentinel or Rhystic Study or Mystic Remora that tax our opponents. It's going to be really hard for our opponents to pay the extra tax on those cards and basically let us get extra card draw off them. Lord Drakis is back from the previous Skirmish version. We didn't use it in the battle version, but in the glory version we actually have a combo. So Lord Drakis plus Dockside Extortionist plus one of our bounce spells. So something like Snap or Winds of Rebuke or Geist Wave. So basically we can return one of the Dockside to our hand. So we'll cast our Dockside, and then we'll put our Lord Drakis on top of it, and then we will bounce the Dockside back to our hand, and then we can recast the Dockside and then mutate the Lord Drakis back on top of it and return one of our bounce spells to our hands. And this actually becomes a lot easier with Hinata because Hinata is going to make these bounce spells 1 mana instead of 2. Snap is going to require the least amount of treasures made by Dockside, since it's going to untap 2 of the lands. Winds of Rebuke will mill each player by 2 cards. So if we just loop Lord Drakus Dockside and the Winds of Rebuke, we can mill out all of our opponents, pass a turn, and let them die on their upkeeps. Geist Wave will basically be drawing a card, since we're bouncing a permanent that we control to our hand. So with this combo, we can just draw out our entire deck, and then win with something like a Spellseeker, or like we can just brain freeze our opponents to death as well. We've got the Malevolent Hermit to make our non-creature spells uncounterable on the flip side, and on the front side we get to sacrifice it and counter a spell unless they pay an additional 3 mana. So a really strong card in the context of this deck. We've got Ragavan, super strong card, hit our opponents, get some treasures, get some extra value off of our opponent's stuff. Ranger Captain of Eos, so we can tutor up some of our 1-drops. Essentially in the deck we've just got the Ragavan and the Esper Sentinel, but the real power of this card is going to come in with its sacrifice ability, where your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. So you can be a proactive silence, or you can use it as a defensive silence when you want to combo off on your turn. Spellseeker is still in the deck, and this is going to be a really interesting combo piece. So with Spellseeker, we're going to cast our Spellseeker, and we're going to tutor for an Ephemerate. So Ephemerate, exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it has rebound. So we'll get the Ephemerate, and we will flicker our Spellseeker. Spellseeker will enter the battlefield again, and then we will find a Final Fortune, and we will cast the Final Fortune and take an extra turn. So to start this combo, you need 6 mana, a blue, 2 red, and a white, and then the 2 colorless, it doesn't really matter. During the next turn's upkeep, we will cast the Ephemerate from our exile, since it has rebound, targeting our Spellseeker. Spellseeker is going to tutor for an Enlightened Tutor, and since it's still our upkeep, we're going to cast that Enlightened Tutor, and we are going to find Underworld Breach. We will draw the Underworld Breach during our draw step, and then we can cast Underworld Breach. And with the Underworld Breach, we can cast our Ephemerate again. We will target the Spellseeker, flicker the Spellseeker, and from there we can find Brain Freeze. With the Brain Freeze, we can start milling our deck, targeting ourselves, and then from there we can recast our Enlightened Tutor, and the Enlightened Tutor can either find Lion's Eye Diamond or the Lotus Petal, and from there we can cast the Brain Freeze again and mill one of these 2 cards that we tutored for with the Enlightened Tutor into our graveyard, and then from there we can loop Lion's Eye Diamond and Lotus Petal with the Brain Freeze to continually get more storm count, and then eventually we can either target ourselves repeatedly over and over and over again and then cast the Thassa's Oracle to win that way, or we can just get a storm count that's so high that we just mill out all of our opponents past the turn and let them deck out. A really cool thing about Hinata in the context of Brain Freeze loops is that Hinata makes Brain Freeze cost 1 instead of 2, so executing this combo with the Lotus Petal becomes much easier in the context of this deck. Moving on to the sorceries, we've got the By Force Still, super powerful card. Again, there's a ton of mana ramp that is artifact based in the cEDH format, so By Force is going to be a huge blowout. Gamble, super powerful tutor. Jessica's Will, since it does target a player, it's going to cost 2 mana instead of 3, so not bad. It's already a strong card, so now that it's 2 mana, it's even better. Merchant Scroll, a really great tutor, find stuff like Brain Freeze. Preordained, so we can look through our deck. Savine's Reclamation, really powerful reanimation spell, especially when we pair it with our Intuition piles. Solve the Equation. Supreme Verdict, again, fantastic board wipe, uncounterable, and a Windfall. so we can reload our hand if we have some of those fast starts with like the Mana Crypt land or Mox, Opal, Soul Ring, Chrome Mox type of stuff, so we can kind of catch our opponents off guard if we have this on turn 1. In the instance, we've got some nice cheap interaction that we've used as we upgrade into the next power level. Again, we're not going to have Hinata out 100% of the time, and especially during the early turns of the game, we want to have efficient interaction that we can use to stop our opponents from doing some of their shenanigans as well. So stuff like a Braid, really nice. Deflecting Swap, really great for redirecting targets. We got some forces in here. The bounce spells can be used as removal if we really need to in a pinch. The Intuition is super strong since it does target an opponent. It only costs 2 instead of the normal 3. And if we're setting up our Intuition pile with Savine's Reclamation is also going to cost 1 less. So the, Hinata definitely makes this combo or this line a lot stronger since she's just going to reduce the cost of the spells. So if you have like the Underworld Breach already in your hand, you can get the Lion's Eye Diamond and the Lotus Petal, or the Savine's Wreck and the Brain Freeze. Or if you've got like the Brain Freeze in your hand already, you can get the Savine's Wreck, the Lotus Petal, Lion's Eye Diamond, and the Underworld Breach. Just really flexible, whichever piece you already have. So really strong there. Some extra tutors like Mystical Tutor and Lightning Tutor. I've already explained the line with that, and Spellseeker. And a Silence to help protect our own combos and stop our opponents from comboing off when they need to cast multiple spells to get their stuff going. And another thing about Hinata is that she makes some of these interaction spells super cheap. So like 1 mana a Braid is fantastic. 1 mana bounce spells are really great. 1 mana you find some Prisoners. All these cards, they're already really great, but if we have a Hinata out, they just get ridiculous. We've upgraded the artifacts. We're still on the 2 mana stuff, but we've also added some of the free stuff like Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, again the Lion's Eye and the Lotus Petal for our Underworld Breach combos, stuff like Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, and a Grinding Station just as an extra combo piece with the Underworld Breach. So essentially, if we have a Mox Opal or like a Mana Crypt, we can generate mana, so we can tap them for mana, sacrifice them with Grinding Stone, and mill ourselves for 3 cards, and then we can use those 3 cards to escape one of these rocks back out, and then from there continue to loop that over and over and over again. We can select which cards we're exiling from our graveyard until we eventually find a Brain Freeze to mill ourselves a bunch and hopefully find Lotus Petal or the Lion's Eye Diamond and get that combo going, or we can just find the Dual Caster Mage Twin Flame combo and go from there. And the enchantment's pretty straightforward. Mystical Mora, Heuristic Study, and the Underworld Breach. These 2 cards are really strong in the context of Hinata, as I said before, because she increased the cost of our opponent's spell. It's going to be really hard for our opponents to actually pay for the extra cost on these 2 cards and let us net that extra card draw. Pretty sweet. With the lands, we've definitely improved the lands pretty substantially. Again, as we move up in power levels, we want all of our lands to start entering the battlefield untapped, and that's mainly because in the beginning turns of especially cEDH, those turns are super vital. So making sure that our lands are entering untapped is really important so that we can interact with our opponents and also just accelerate our game plan as fast as possible. We don't really want our lands to be entering the battlefield tapped, generally speaking. Sometimes, you can fetch for like a Steam Vents at the end of someone's turn if you really don't need to be using the mana right then and there. But for the most part, we want our lands to be entering untapped. We've also added Otawara, Soaring City. So this, unfortunately, does not get reduced by Hinata with its ability. It will get reduced if we have Hinata out, but this is an ability and not necessarily a spell. So discard Otawara, Soaring City, return target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. Thanks again for checking out this episode of Opal Wave MTG. Again, I'm your host, Jacob, and until next time.